I'd like to call our next witness, who is Dr. David Martin, who's attending by video. Dr. Martin, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. I know you sent a CV either late last night or this morning, which we will enter as an exhibit, but I spent some time without the benefit of that CV trying to figure out how on earth do I introduce you. And I have to say that you are one of the most difficult people I've ever had to introduce before. And I'm going to go through some things that you have done. And so you were an assistant professor of radiology and orthopedic surgery at the University of Virginia at one time.
That's right.
Your first invention was a laser integrated system to target and treat inoperable tumors.
That's right.
Your mathematics helped unravel the way the human body processes hormones, and this has led to the detection and treatment of many diseases.
Hang on a second. Turn on the time. There you go.
Right. So I'd said that your mathematics helped unravel the way the human body processes hormones, and this has led to the detection and treatment of many diseases. Is that correct?
That is also correct.
Right. And we were speaking earlier in the week, and you were sharing that you're involved in technology that you've developed to basically take creosote out of wood and help clean up oil sands, ponds, and the like.
Yes, indeed.
You've set up top-performing global equity funds.
Yes, it was a CNBC IQ, which then became a series of traded funds. That's correct.
You have expertise in biological weapons.
I do indeed. Late 1980.
Right. You first wrote your first classified briefing about bioweapons and corruptions in 2001, and you've been presenting and sharing evidence since then.
Yeah, we'll go over.
Okay, now, and here's where it's, and I'm touching on things, like we're going to go into how you basically founded this company called M-CAM that basically, tracks what's going on with patents and has expertise in basically intangible assets and basically how to promote those.
Yeah, M-CAM was established in 1998 as a mechanism to provide underwriting assets for what became a principal underwriting in 68 countries, so that intangible assets could be collateral in banking transactions.
Right, and so you're kind of all over the place. And I was thinking last night, who is David Martin? And I don't know if you'll like what I came up with or not, but I thought, if Aristotle had actually been a financial philosopher, you would actually be kind of a cross between Aristotle and Nikola Tesla.
There you go.
So like it or not, that's kind of what I came up with. Now, I'd like to swear you in, because at the National Citizens Inquiry we take evidence under oath. So can you please state your full name for the record and spell your first name?
David Earl Martin.
Okay, and then do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Now, we were talking about this M-CAM that you formed. My understanding is basically you've got a system that watches what's happening as people file patents, and it will flag things for you if you've asked things to be flagged.
So there are two things that it does, Sean. The first is that we can set information triggers which allow us to have something detected. We can also flag something a little more interesting, which is when we see things that are written in a way that clearly appear to be trying to obfuscate the ordinary meaning of a thing. And that's actually quite a more interesting thing, because you're interested in what people are disclosing, but you're even more interested in what they're trying to hide. And so that second function is something that has been exceptionally important in law enforcement and in a number of other applications.
And I want to flesh that out, because it's something that I skipped over when I was introducing you. But you've basically been involved in creating this model that helps detect when people are lying by omission or obfuscation?
Yeah, so I'll give you a good example. Sitting here on my desk, I have a thing called a cup. We would all agree this is probably a cup or a mug. But if I actually found a document that referred to a porcelain cylindrical vessel for the temporary containment of an aqueous solution, which would be how a cup would be described in a patent, then what I know is that somebody is trying willfully to make sure that the concept of cup is not found. And so in those kinds of situations where we have what we consider to be normal linguistic signatures, just like we think of DNA or we think of any of these other models of information, what we do is we're looking for patterns of non-normal communication behaviors. And one of the things we've done is mapped what we call the base pairs of communication, roughly 86,000 across every known language. And we will look for normal patterns of expression, and then we look at non-normal patterns of expression. And it is the non-normal patterns that we often like to flag just because we want to know why somebody seems to be intent on hiding something.
Right, so your system will automatically be checking patent applications that have been filed and bringing this type of thing to your attention.
That's correct.
And that system has brought to your attention some things that you're going to share with us today. And so maybe I'll just cut you loose, because my understanding is you kind of have some slides to share with us in a presentation. But I just wanted the commissioners to understand, how is it that David Martin came to see things like patents and start investigating this?
Well, and I think, Sean, it's important to point out, if you think of the work that we're going to make reference to a little later on, some of the most alarming patents that we've seen are when we see science clearly being manipulated. So, and I'm going to get into this a little more, but I'll use this as an example. If you see somebody say an infectious replication defective virus, well, there's something interesting and highly problematic about that linguistic signature, because viruses, by their definition in the model that will promote around viruses as a construct, rely on replication as a criteria for a virus to be a virus. So what is a virus that doesn't replicate? Well, it isn't a virus using the definitions that people use as a viral model. So it's important to realize that these kinds of linguistic subtleties, which you might look past and you might have no real even possibility of detecting or understanding, those kinds of things become highly problematic when you see them, and then you go in and you understand that you're not searching for a target. One of the key things I've said throughout all of the COVID scam is that the difference between what I've been doing and what most others have been doing is I haven't been doing any inquiry or investigation. I've had machines that have been surfacing these problems actually for quite a long time. In this particular instance, we have been surfacing this particular allegedly coronavirus problem since the whole spike protein vaccine patents that Pfizer filed back in 1990. So this has been something that has been on our radar for a long time.
Right. So I'll ask you to go into your presentation, and then I'm going to have some further questions for you.
Yeah. So I think I can share a screen here. I just pop this out here, and all right. Now, can you see the slides?
We don't. Yes, we see a slide that's labeled "An Injection of Truth: Bioweapons and Their Creators."
Yeah, perfect. So I made reference to this presentation just a few days ago, but I do think it's worth putting out into the context of what we're talking about. In 1979, Friedrich August von Hayek talked about the fact that the use of an emergency in the public sector is really about having the pretext to suspend liberty and to suspend the ordinary rule of law. And it's important to realize that this information, this observation made by von Hayek, is actually an observation that was made based on his review of a number of things going back largely to the Second World War and what happened across the Second World War in both the Allied and the Axis powers, where the construct of emergency was used as the context in which you could suspend liberty. But it's important to realize that this goes much further back than this. I pointed out in a previous presentation several months ago that if we go back to the 17th and 18th century in the United States, specifically the use of quarantine powers, and these were typically wielded by people who had port authority or port agency, ultimately what in the United States became what we call the Department of Health and Human Services now, which back in the late 1600s and early 1700s were the port masters' offices of quarantine. The minute you allege that there is an emergency or you allege there is a problem, the derivative of that allegation is emergency powers which suspend liberty. And it's important that we understand that this has been around, for a long time. This observation obviously published in 79, but it's important to point that out. This slide that I have on the screen now is probably problematic at its core because it lays out the long duration of this attempt to get to a coronavirus vaccine program. But what's important about this is this was a statement made by Peter Daszak during the gain-of-function moratorium, while Ralph Baric, Peter Daszak, and Anthony Fauci were all violating the gain-of-function moratorium under a letter that NIAID sent to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in October of 2014, where Anthony Fauci authorized Ralph Baric's lab at UNC Chapel Hill not only to pursue the gain of function on coronavirus, but specifically added that it should be increasing its activities during the gain of function moratorium by placing the research in vivo, meaning to put it into living organisms. So while the world thought that there was a moratorium on gain of function research, at that very time, Peter Daszak, Ralph Baric, and Anthony Fauci colluded with the following mandate, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, we need to increase public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Now, the reason why this particular quote is so alarming is at the time, the World Health Organization had declared that the coronavirus and SARS-CoV infectious conditions in the human condition were eradicated. So it seems quite odd that there would be a need for medical countermeasures, which is a legal definition term out of the 2005 PrEP Act. It's very bizarre that we would need medical countermeasures for a eradicated disease, because obviously, if it's eradicated, you actually don't need a pan-coronavirus vaccine. And the use of the term pan-coronavirus vaccine itself is problematic, because at that point in time, we had already allegedly isolated and CDC had patented SARS 1.0, that patent we're going to get to in a minute. But why do we need to have a broad spectrum coronavirus vaccine when allegedly the human exposure and the human risk with respect to a potential pandemic or pandemic enabling pathogen was declared eradicated? It was a very problematic quote, and it was published in the National Academy of Sciences March 2015 publication from the Countermeasure Response to an Infectious Disease Program that was done in 2014. Now, I've made reference to the fact that there were a series of exceptionally problematic documents that come out of a variety of places, but we're going to start with the most problematic of them all, and that is the patent that Ralph Barrick, Christopher Curtis, and Boyd Yount filed from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which was filed in its Patent Cooperation Treaty application April 19th of 2002, but the priority of the filing, the provisional filing, was April 20th, 2001. And if we go back to look at that patent, we see that there are two grant numbers, AI 23946 and GM 63228 from the National Institutes of Health, which gave the United States government what's called march-in rights under the Bayh-Dole Act, such that there was an ability to have the federal government access this innovation and this invention without any restriction by virtue of the fact that it was funded by NIH. This also was done with support coming from the Carolina Vaccine Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which has very strong ties to GlaxoSmithKline. The problem with this particular patent, if we look at patent 7279327, which was ultimately issued October 9 of 2007, but remember that the priority date was April 20th, 2001, and the PCT, or the Patent Cooperation Treaty global filing, was April 19th, 2002. What makes this problematic is that it says the invention may be carried out with any coronavirus, such as human respiratory coronavirus. And the reason why that particular phrase is problematic is that when you look at the actual material in this patent, you find that what historically had been canine and porcine coronavirus, which was the thing that was the greatest commercial and public concern back in 2001, now became a human respiratory coronavirus specifically targeting lung epithelial cells. As we all know, the first alleged outbreak of the respiratory problem, which we called SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, in 2002 going into 2003, was in fact the first time we had a infectious replication defective, which is what this patent is, outbreak, according to the official records, of a respiratory coronavirus in humans. We did not have any of the evidence of that happening prior to the disclosure and the technology disclosed inside of this invention, which we know was actually established by work done starting in 1999. If we look at the grant numbers, we know these grant numbers were specifically funding research that Ralph Barrick and his team were doing starting in 1999, moving through 2002. And what makes the research associated with these grants most problematic is that in all of their research, they knew that not only were they targeting human respiratory tissue, but they also published and were very aware of the fact that what they had done manipulated the coronavirus models such that they could actually harm the myocardial tissue in mammals. Most notably in this particular research, they showed that they could create cardiomyopathy in rabbits. Now, you know that we have the original filing of this patent in April 20th of 2001. That's the priority date. But then you see at the peak of what we called the coronavirus outbreak that we associated with SARS, the winter of 2002 going into the spring of 2003, that on April the 25th, 2003, we have the Center for Disease Control and Prevention filing a patent on coronavirus isolated from humans. What makes this particular patent, and this one is patent 7220852, What makes this patent most problematic is that it's actually illegal to file this patent. The CDC broke the law when it filed it. And the reason why I say that is because it's actually technically correct. Under 2 rejections of this patent, when it was being considered by the Patent Office, it was rejected for unpatentability of subject matter. And the reason for that is that the information that they used to file this patent was already in the public domain prior to the filing of the patent, meaning that it was not available to be used as part of a patent filing. They even make reference to those conditions with the GenBank filings that had been done by the Chinese well in advance of the application that was filed by CDC. And if we go back and we look, we find out that the vast majority of the information that was covered in this particular patent subject matter was allegedly materials that were a result of collaboration between researchers at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and researchers and samples of research taken in China. So what we know about this particular set of patents, beginning in 2001, going through April of 2003, we happen to know that essentially the patented subject matter of turning the coronavirus model into what became what we call now a severe acute respiratory syndrome was an invention, not a natural transmission or a natural evolution of what we now call the coronavirus, disease or pathogen model. And this is such a critical point that I'm going to pause and allow you to ask a question before I move forward, because this one is so absolutely essential that people understand. We did not have SARS until we invented SARS.
When I was trying to interrupt you earlier, that was just the point I wanted to make, is I wanted people to understand. So we have this SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003, but that was basically a man-made virus.
Well, let's be technically correct. As I said, we actually can't quite get away with calling it a virus here for the simple reason that we now know, based on everything in the patent that I have here, 7279327, that they specifically used the viral model and they used attributes of the both cDNA as well as what ultimately became things that we associated with RNA. They used information that they derived from their model of coronavirus, but what they made was not a virus. What they made was what we'll get to in my next slides. What they made is something that they described as biowarfare enabling technology.
Right. So, but people can understand that back in 2002, 2003, when they or people close to them were sick with SARS, that they were sick with something that had been created with U.S. government funding and then released to the public.
That is absolutely correct. There is no evidence at all that this was a natural evolution at all. And so the debates that took place in 2019, 2020, and 2021 about whether these were naturally occurring mutations from bats in China, all of that was theater to cover up for the published facts. And this is why it's so problematic in the public facts to show that we know that beginning in 1992, and I have it now on this slide, and we'll just get to the middle of it, the chimeric coronavirus. And what I mean by that is the terms that were used, where if we look at the publication from Journal Infectious Disease, November of 1992, we see that Ralph Barrick's lab had successfully, in 1992, allowed the original model that they described as coronavirus to become this chimeric structure, this gain-of-function structure that was known to target the human heart and other heart tissue.
Back in 1992, so they developed the technology in 1992 to use this platform to affect heart tissue.
Yes, and remember that we knew that from Pfizer's patent, which I have on this screen too. And I'll just go through the screen briefly, but patent 6372224, which was filed in November of 2000. We know from that patent and from the literature cited in that patent that the spike protein associated with the coronavirus associated with SARS was something that was known to be the target agent that would be used for vaccine programs, and Pfizer filed its first spike protein patent November of 2000. So the whole thing predates SARS, absolutely.
And it long predates COVID-19. So we name it COVID-19 for 2019, but basically this had been going on for decades.
That's exactly right. And there is, when we get into the current pandemic allegations, the answer, as you look at all of both the real all-cause mortality as well as the life insurance data from 2020, you'll know that the pandemic that we were supposedly having with people getting sick was actually not a pandemic from people getting sick from some natural process. They were getting infected with a material that had been human manufactured. We know that in the early days of this pandemic, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but we know in the early days of the pandemic, the CDC actually published the fact that they were shipping contaminated swabs. So the likelihood that people were getting exposed to this pathogen through introduced swabs is actually pretty reliable, since they admitted to doing that.
So what
makes that more interesting, however, is the context for this particular slide. Because when Tyrell, Bino, and others were able to first isolate what they described coronavirus in 1965, published in the Lancet in 1966, we know that in the period immediately following the description, there were material harvested from the respiratory tract of what were considered to be sick patients in the United States. And in 1967, there was an effort undertaken by McIntosh, Bradburn, and others to take the samples from what were considered to be sick people and put it into what are called healthy volunteers. This paper, published in the British Journal of Medicine in 1967, showed the first, what I would represent as a weaponization use of the coronavirus model. The first time that was done was described when U.S. samples were used to infect British healthy volunteers in 1967. And what we see in 1973 in the journal publication Chest, 1973, we actually see that we were able to show that the introduction of this kind of material, the material described as coronavirus, was actually tested in asthmatic children in 1973. So when you look at the history of this, we know that we had a awareness of what was basically described as a common cold back in the 1960s and early 70s, which was then in the late I would say early 1990s with respect to the Journal of Infectious Disease program, where the modified chimera of the model was used to target myocardial tissue. We can see in both the Pfizer patent that was followed as well as the 2002 patent that we made reference to before for the infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. In those two patents, we see that the gain-of-function research was specifically targeting making the respiratory tissue exposure the gain-of-function target to create a more lethal and more deadly pathogen. Do I still have you, Sean?
Yes, yes, you do. I was just thinking
I
you were
just
moving to
wanted
the
to
next
make
slide.
the final point. I had already made reference to the CDC patent, and I'll just, for the sake of reference, take you back to this April 25th, 2003 patent, which was filed by CDC. 2 days later, a company called Sequoia Pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical company in Rockville, Maryland, right near the FDA. Sequoia Pharmaceuticals, the company that had never done anything, never had produced any product, filed a patent 2 days after the CDC patent filing on the vaccine for SARS coronavirus. Now, I want to be very clear on the fact that it is scientifically and absolutely impossible for a company to file a patent for a vaccine for something that had been only described 2 days earlier in a patent filing. And the reason why that's problematic is because patent filings are filed in a paper form at the patent office, and for a period of between 9 and 18 months are not disclosed in any form to the public. So it would be quite literally impossible for Sequoia Pharmaceuticals to have ever had access to allegedly CDC's patented coronavirus isolated from humans unless they were working together. And unless there had been no invention in April of 2003 of SARS coronavirus, it had been something that, as you read the Sequoia Pharmaceuticals patent on the vaccine for coronavirus, it becomes very clear that that particular patent came from collaboration that predated the pandemic itself in 2002. Let me pause before I get into this next slide. So if you have a question, we can do it.
Well, it's just interesting. So just so people understand what you're saying, is you're basically saying, look, at the CDC files a patent in April of 2003, but that's not going to be public for roughly about 18 months. So nobody's going to know what the patent describes. Well, 2 days later, Sequoia files a patent for a vaccine that they can't know about in response to this CDC filing. So for the same pathogen. And the point you're making is they had to be working together. And then, you know, it's the question begging to be asked is, well, why would Sequoia even make a vaccine? Where's the need for a vaccine for a pathogen controlled by the CDC and which is not, you know, in the human population?
Well, and this is where the problem gets quite difficult, Sean, because the fact is that if you go back and look, the two inventors on the Sequoia Pharmaceuticals patent had no respiratory background whatsoever. They had no virology background with respect to anything that had anything to do with a respiratory pathogen. And so we have two people who allegedly are inventing a vaccine for a thing that they could not have known about in a company that had never produced a single thing. And lo and behold, here they're filing patent 2 days after the CDC patent gets filed for a vaccine that could not have possibly been known about, but for the fact that this was collusion that predates 2002. Now, that becomes highly problematic because if people remember that in September of 2001, there was an enormous number of people that got very concerned about another pathogen that had also been released by the United States military into the common population. And that was the September release of anthrax. Now, if we go back and look at the history of anthrax, we realize that there has been a public concern around anthrax, the pathogen, which was engineered by the United States Department of Defense, and the exposure to anthrax vaccines that were notably used in the troops that were sent to the Middle East for the first and second Gulf Wars. There was an enormous amount of inquiry into whether or not those early anthrax vaccines were potentially the cause, or at least contributed to what was called Gulf War syndrome. And there were a series of inquiries in which that information went all the way through congressional hearings And that's congressional material, much of which went into some of my company MCAM's briefings on bioweapons and what we called vector weaponization. Now, vector weaponization is a term that not everyone is used to. It is actually a series of publications that my company MCAM has published for law enforcement. In this particular case, the reference I'm making is the RT-PCR SARS references from our 2003 bioweapons and vector weaponization publication that was done in response to both the anthrax outbreak in 2001 as well as the SARS alleged outbreak in 2002. When we did the briefings in 2002 and again in 2010 about the bioengineering dangers of what was going on with the bioweapons program, people largely dismissed them because they stated that the official position was that the United States was not doing anything in biological weapons. Now, tragically, in the 15th European Symposium of Animal, Plant, and Microbial Toxins in Ljubljana, Slovenia, in 2004, I actually specifically gave a complete briefing on the proliferation and commercialization of biological and chemical weapons for military use. And I was doing that in 2004, and not surprisingly, in the exact same period, there was another briefing going on, a Keystone Symposium, where Ralph Barrick made reference to the fact that the coronavirus model was very, very highly adaptable and quite functional as a biological weapon. The program that he actually spoke to was using reverse genetics and full-length infectious cDNA of SARS as a potential biologic weapon. That was 2004. And then in 2005, and this is where it becomes extremely problematic, because he, at a DARPA MITRE event, made reference to his synthetic coronavirus as, and I'm quoting, biological warfare enabling technologies. I want everybody to just make sure that they understand this was an express statement at a DARPA MITRE conference where the term biological warfare enabling technologies was associated with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's gain of function research. Now, tragically, in the spring, March of 2005, I was asked to give the keynote address in the Islamic Republic of Iran in Tehran, where I gave a keynote address around proliferation of bioengineering technologies, and specifically did so at the National Research Center for Genetic and Engineering and Biological Technologies Congress on bioethics in 2005. Now, what made that particular event so interesting is at the event in Iran, we were being advised that there was an enormous amount of United States and European-sponsored biological weapons research, including the use of broadleaf plants, tobacco, tomatoes, and others, to create edible vaccines for a host of pathogens. And at the event in Tehran, I was advised by a number of researchers who approached me asking me about the various biological agents that they knew were being developed by the United States bioweapons program. So when I use the term biological weapons or biowarfare enabling technology, the reason I use it is because that is the language that is being used by the individuals who actually made the gain of function research. That is not David Martin opining on a thing. It's simply reporting the facts. And if we look at 2005, we see that during the exact same period of the biowarfare enabling technologies project with the DARPA MITRE conference Ralph Barrick conducted in the United States, at exactly the same time, Barrick Zhang Li, the woman we now refer to as the Bat Lady in the most recent pandemic, and Peter Daszak all worked together on a USAID project that was specifically DARPA and NIAID funded under the first biodefense grant, U54 AI 057157, where $10 million, slightly over $10 million, was sent to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for the sake of doing biowarfare application gain-of-function research on coronavirus. Let's get that date in everybody's mind. This is USAID starting with their PREDICT program specifically around gain-of-function, specifically around SARS-CoV, and that grant was first granted in 2005, bringing the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill into direct collaboration. What makes this even more problematic is that in 2014, during the gain-of-function moratorium, we actually have University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill getting an exemption from NIAID, a letter written in October from NIAID to UNC Chapel Hill saying that despite the fact that the gain-of-function moratorium was in place, they were authorized to continue research on their gain-of-function COV. And the COV in question, we actually find out in 2016 at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we find out that what they were doing gain-of-function research on was, are you ready for this? SARS-like WIV1-CoV, quote, poised for human emergence. Now, what is WIV1-CoV? That is Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. And by 2016, in violation of the gain-of-function moratorium, they actually said it was ready for human emergence. Now, Sean, this is such a highly problematic publication. Setting aside, for the sake of this conversation, the fact that it happened during the gain-of-function moratorium, and setting aside the fact that the biodefense grants that had been going into this on an annual basis since 2005 led to a publication in 2016 saying that it was the Wuhan Institute of Virology coronavirus which was going to be poised for human emergence. That, standing by itself, is enough of a problem. When you look at the fact that between 2010 and 2018, Moderna and BioNTech, the arm of Pfizer that we all have become aware of, were engaged in a series of projects trying to figure out how to build vaccines using RNA technology. All of this becomes highly problematic when in April of 2019, so this is months before allegedly patient one in Wuhan, Moderna amended its patent filings to include the terms accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen.
Can I just break in, because this is what
accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen at the very time that they had already stated that SARS Wuhan virus 1 was poised for human emergence.
But what I find interesting about that language, poised for human emergence, is, I think most of us could get our heads around that, government, military agencies might violate a moratorium to develop a biological weapon to be used on the enemy. But I don't recall us being at war, Dr. Martin, in 2016 or 2019.
Or 17 or 18.
Yeah. So that's what I find interesting about the words emergence, human emergence, is it's implying that they were planning on releasing this on their own population.
Well, and we know now because of disclosures that have come out of a number of FOIA requests in the United States, we know this is not the first time the Department of Defense has actually intentionally infected healthy populations. We We've seen that happen in New York subway systems. We've seen it happen in other public subway systems. We've seen it happen in a number of places where tests have been done on the public, where we release all kinds of things and then we see how many people get sick. That's something that has happened on a number of occasions. So this is not the first, nor will it be the last time, unless we actually have public intervention to make sure that we have all of this stuff addressed once and for all.
And just to give that a Canadian flavor, I mean, I think it's well known that that happened in Winnipeg, I think in the 60s, where they deliberately, released biological agents to see how many people in Winnipeg would get sick.
Yes, this is not the first time it's happened, and the public needs to understand that the weaponization of what are derived from biological models agents are things that have been going on for a long time, and we need to have legislation that outlaws that categorically, because the only time it's ever been used is against the civilian population. Now, most people are not aware that the European Investment Bank provided 50 million euros to BioNTech on the 17th of December 2019. And that date is exceptionally problematic given what was going on. So remember, we've got an award granted on the 17th of December 2019 to BioNTech. If anybody's familiar with the way federal funding works or federal grants work, you realize that in many instances it takes at least months, if not years, to build an application, to put that application through peer review, to get that peer review ultimately scored, and for that to ultimately result in a funding grant. So the fact that by 17th of December 2019, we have BioNTech receiving a grant, we actually know from the receipt of that grant that the grant had to predate that by at least months and possibly years. And why would it be that both Moderna, who in 2018 was fighting over the Canadian lipid nanoparticle patent technology, and the European Investment Bank, who mysteriously on the 17th of December 2019 supplies BioNTech with a 50 million euro grant for their RNA vaccine production, these two things just scream that every single person knew that not only was Moderna and BioNTech already chosen to be the successors of interest to the pandemic that was about to be unleashed on the population, but the funding mechanism for all of them predate the first patient allegation in China. So prior to a pandemic, BioNTech and Moderna both sit loaded with the formula for the vaccine and the funding for the vaccine before there's a pathogen.
Was that ever a lucky guess, eh?
Amazing, particularly given that neither company had successfully launched a product outside any of the now emergency use authorization. Now here comes the bad news. Up until now, we could say that these are all just allegations. Problem is, the synthetic coronavirus biohacking program that I referred to before comes right off of Ralph Barrick's curriculum vitae. He very famously put that as a moment of pride to say that that was something that he did, which is part of his professional history. We also know that all of these organizations were part of a collaboration that was called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board at the World Health Organization. And it's important to look at the document I have highlighted as a screen capture on the right-hand side of this slide, where they start off with countries, donors, and multilateral institutions must be prepared for the worst. A rapidly spreading pandemic due to a lethal respiratory pathogen, whether naturally emergent or accidentally or deliberately released, poses an additional preparedness requirement. That language, accidentally or deliberately released, matches the accidental or deliberate release language from the Moderna patent of April of 2019. The document I'm showing you comes from the September 18th, 2019 document World at Risk, developed by the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. And they specifically say that the success indicators by September 2020 are donors and countries commit to identify timelines and financing for the development of a universal influenza vaccine, broad-spectrum antivirals, and targeted therapeutics. Now, what makes this particular document so problematic, and remember, this document was published September 18th, 2019. So they're telling us that we need to have a vaccine, a universal vaccine, by September 2020. The image on the cover of this document is, are you ready for this? An image of a coronavirus. They're telling us in September of 2019 that we're going to have this lethal respiratory pathogen outbreak. We're going to do it so that we get countries to get financing and development for universal vaccines. And they published that on September 18th, 2019.
Can I just
3.5 months before there even was an alleged patient with coronavirus.
Can I just break in, because I want people to understand, when you're saying a universal platform for a vaccine, we're really talking about bringing in this mRNA platform.
Correct.
As a vaccine platform. So we use an emergency to basically get the public to accept a new platform that otherwise would have to go through years and years and years of development to be accepted.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Well, and remember that one day later, so this was September 18th, 2019, on September 19th, 2019, one day later, President Trump signed the executive order which authorized the rapid development of this universal vaccine platform. So that was signed as an executive order September 19th, 2019. There was no outbreak of influenza in 2019 that executive order was necessary for. That executive order, September 19th, 2019, 3.5 months before there was ever even an allegation of a pandemic, was done so that this process would be put in motion and all of the related things would ultimately unfold.
So can I just ask a question then? So
Certainly.
When we hear about warp speed being announced, basically there would already a program in progress before that announcement.
That's exactly right. A year before warp speed, or 6.5 months before warp speed was even discussed, warp speed had already started.
Thank you.
Now, I have this document to show Canadians' complicity in what was going on in this run up to the pandemic. If you go back to 2018, you'll see that the filing in March 5th of 2018 was a filing where Protiva Biotherapeutics, which is one of the multiple corporate entities that came out of the University of British Columbia, we had a set of fights going on around who owned the lipid nanoparticle, the lipid nanoparticle technology that was ultimately going to be used in the injections. And it's important to realize that the Patent Trials Appeal Board in the United States was asked to consider whether or not the UBC technology was in fact patented or whether Moderna could use it without infringing on any of the Protiva and or Arbutus Acuitas UBC technology. That particular filing of the contested nature of the lipid nanoparticle for vaccines started March 5th of 2018. And in the September of 2018, we actually have the ability for all of the procedural elements of that case to be filed. The final decision ultimately being issued on September of 2019, not surprisingly, precisely at the time that the World Health Organization released the World at Risk statement saying that we are going to move forward with a universal platform. If you go back and you look, you see that the Canadian government and the U.S. government both knew, by virtue of the fact that this very public dispute was happening on both sides of the border, they knew that Moderna was going to ultimately have to deal with the fact that the University of British Columbia patents on the lipid nanoparticle were actually known to have been part of the mRNA vaccine program in development. And ultimately, the Patent Trials Appeal Board ruled in favor of the fact that UBC was going to have a seat at the table for manufacturing these injections. So the Canadians, by September of 2019, knew that regardless of which one of the companies, either BioNTech or Moderna, regardless of which one of them would ultimately become the global dominating player with respect to lipid nanoparticles, at some point, Canada and the University of British Columbia technology was going to be part of the solution. It was going to be used as part of the distribution of the mRNA injections. Now, the reason why that's critically important is Canadian law outlaws any participation in anything that is the known enablement of production or distribution or introduction of biological weapons into any population. By September 11th, 2019, Canada knew that the technology coming out of the University of British Columbia was going to be the enabling technology that meets the legal definition in Canada and the legal definition in the United States of a biological weapon. And why do I say that with the level of precision I'm saying? I'm saying that because if you follow the provenance of the alleged information that went from Wuhan Institute of Virology's biological weapons program, the DARPA PREDICT program, if you go from that program to the institution of the mRNA injections that started at the VRC in the U.S. in 2019, and what we saw in the European Union grant to BioNTech in 2019, we know that the information that was transmitted across government and across international borders, which is actually what triggers the biological weapons program, was A, known to be a scheduled toxin to public health. We knew it was actually a lethal agent, as stated in 2016, and we knew that the enabling technology to get this lethal agent into the population was going to be reliant on Canadian technology in violation of Canada's own biological weapons laws. None of these things are allegations. These are all published facts that were known prior to the inception of the pandemic.
So just, we hear about that basically we are manipulated by, governments and power systems with this formula, problem, create a problem, reaction, and solution. And, it wasn't just Canada, the whole world experienced this problem where we're just being told literally that we're all going to die and our loved ones are going to die. The level of fear was fantastic. We react in fear. We react by consenting to locking down, by consenting to masking, by basically consenting to destroy our small businesses, by ruining education. And yet the solution was already in play and being prepared, is what you're telling us, before we were even presented with the problem, let alone reacting.
That's correct. And that's why it's important to understand that while the narrative, as you described it, is correct, we are told we have something to fear. We're told that the people who told us we had something to fear have the solution, and then we call for the solution, and we ultimately take the solution. In this particular case, the solution was an a priori already known reality. There was no chance that the public was going to have a chance anything other than they were going to accept an experimental gene therapy. That was going to be the outcome, period. And remember, the reason why I use that terminology is in April of 2020, in both the BioNTech and in the Moderna SEC filings, they explicitly state that mRNA injections are, and I'm quoting from their regulatory filings, classified as experimental gene therapy. They are not, and they never have been designated as what meets the legal standard of a vaccine as defined under the 1986 Act, which is the last time vaccines were legally defined in the United States. And by the way, I'm distinguishing the difference between public acclamation and legal definition. The legal definition of a vaccine still requires that it disrupts infection or transmission. The practical public health redefinition, which was done by fiat, but it was never codified into law, states that a vaccine must disrupt infection or transmission. And in this particular case, we knew that both infection and transmission were not going to have any impact whatsoever on what was going to be injected into people's arms. mRNA was going to be a platform forced onto the population, despite the fact that it was in fact known to be, disclosed to be, and officially classified in April 2020 as experimental gene therapy.
Now, Dr. Martin, I'm going to ask, how much time do you have to give us? Because we have time on our end. I'm just curious how much time you have on your end.
I have us booked up until 1:30.
Okay.
So I'm almost done with this. But I wanted to just highlight one very problematic thing that also took place in February of 2018. And that is that the European Union and the World Health Organization and interests here in the United States changed the definition of an adverse event following immunization. And an adverse event following immunization, or AEFI, was in fact something that was modified in 2018 to mean that there is only an adverse event if the adverse event has already been published in the literature. Now, the reason why that becomes a highly problematic reality is given the fact that there was no literature establishing human exposure to any of these mRNA injections because they were experimental gene therapies and had never been approved or authorized even for experimental use. Because that, there was no possibility that there had been literature published which would have described the adverse events with respect to human exposure to the mRNA. But in February of 2018, the definition of adverse event was changed so that it was impossible to have an adverse event to these injections.
No.
It was absolutely mandated to be an impossibility. There was no way you could have had an adverse event because they changed what an adverse event actually is.
What's troubling about this, wasn't it President Eisenhower that said nothing happens by accident in the government?
Correct.
So here we have the development of this, I'll call it a vaccine, but I appreciate, based on your presentation, I'm incorrect. But basically this weapon that's going to be released, we're about to start funding and developing the vaccine for the weapon. But just prior to doing that, we are changing the definition of adverse reactions so that when there is harm caused by the vaccine that we're going to prepare for the population, they won't be attributed to the vaccine because you're telling us it's impossible. There will be no scientific literature.
That's what the actual scientific standard was changed to. You cannot have an adverse event unless there has been scientifically published evidence that there is a causal link between the exposure and the event. And because there was no published any experience with this, because it didn't exist, it made having an adverse event impossible. Now, let's get to the who's behind it. It's important to realize that at the inception of the pandemic, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which we have over here on the right, included a number of people that include the Director General of the World Health Organization, the co-chair of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, Dr. Victor Zhao of the National Academy of Medicine in the U.S., Chris Elias from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Sir Jeremy Farr from the Wellcome Trust, Anthony Fauci from NIAID, Ms. Henrietta Fore from the UNCEF and Dr. George Gao of the Chinese CDC. But at the launch of what we call the pandemic, the head of the Wellcome Trust board was Eliza Manningham Buller, who was the head of MI5 security service in the UK. Her position was ultimately taken by Julia Gillard during the pandemic. We have Arup Chakraborty from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have Dame Amelia Fawcett from State Street Investors. And when you see them on the boards of the agent that is saying that the world is going to have a global pandemic, and then you see that they are absolutely financially and politically aligned to the Wellcome Trust's financial interest in advancing all of the platforms with respect to mass immunizations, you then find out a very interesting financial conflict of interest through a company called Syncona. Syncona was a Wellcome Trust family and friends fund that was a joint investment with Facebook and Facebook's co-founder, Dustin Moskowitz. Dustin Moskowitz did two very significant things prior to the pandemic: a Clade X pandemic exercise, as well as the very famous Event 201 in October of 2019, where what we have is a very interesting set of issues, where in Event 201, Dustin Moskowitz, through his fund Open Philanthropy, which co-invests with Syncona's Wellcome Trust, worked together to establish a platform that said we're going to create a global pandemic during which there's going to be an emergency use authorization to authorize a new family of interventions in the form of medical countermeasures. And what was not disclosed to anyone at the outset of this pandemic was Dustin Moskowitz was also a significant investor in a company called Sherlock Biosciences, which happened to be the company that was commercializing and trying to get authorization for CRISPR technology, which is the gene editing technology that's necessary to go in and do significant genetic modification by clipping the portions of DNA that are modified or potentially harmful to humans. What nobody bothered to point out was the guy who had the most to gain. And by the way, if you go back and look after the emergency use authorization was put in place for the pandemic, one of the first authorized approvals that came through the emergency use authorization was CRISPR technology. In other words, we knew from the background of 2000 to 2010, during the lead up to what became Moderna, so the project was called Darwinian Chemical Systems, and that project became Moderna in 2010. We knew that we were going to modify the genome. We knew that that modification of the genome was potentially highly reckless and potentially highly dangerous. So, giant surprise, the gentleman who's financing this entire process, Dustin Moskowitz, co-investing with the Wellcome Trust, headed by Jeremy Farrar, gets together and says, we're going to actually go ahead and do a gene editing technology as part of a program that includes what we know to be a gene editing intervention that's happening through the use of mRNA. It's absolutely critical to know that all of these co-conspirators, and I'm now using that term in the antitrust definition form of what it means to be a co-conspirator, all signed off on the release of a lethal respiratory pathogen for the purpose of an emergency for which they all had financial gain. So this meets all of legal definitions of not only antitrust violations, but also racketeering. Just
because we have
it's not the first time it's happened. I have on this particular slide every one of the same sets of actions that took place over and over again. We have the Flexner Report from 1910 funded by Carnegie, which that gave rise to then the Rockefeller Foundation funding Johns Hopkins University's public health vaccine program. We actually have, in 1941, Wellcome Trust putting in place what became the Therapeutic Substances Act, which ultimately became the UK's version of the FDA. Not surprisingly, the first public vaccine program was the World Health Organization's TB vaccine program, which was partially funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, partially funded by a number of other donors. And we saw in 1952 the first time that Brock Chisholm, who was then the Director General of the World Health Organization, said that the vaccine program that the World Health Organization would be advancing would be for, and I'm quoting from his work, for population control. Immediately after that statement, we started the malaria vaccine program. Burroughs Wellcome Fund became a U.S. fund in 1955, and shortly after that, both the malaria vaccine program and the smallpox vaccine program started in 1967, and then the global initiation of vaccine immunization programs were launched in 1974, leading to the 1988 statement that we were going to have an eradication of polio program, and then you see the history go all the way through. The reason why this slide is so important is to understand that the progression of what I just laid out is something that has been going on now for 115 years. So if we think that somehow or another this was a immediate scare that happened immediately in 2019 going into 2020, I want to be abundantly clear that this program and the elaborate mechanism that allows it to happen has a 115-year head start on the vast majority of the public who think they're aware now. And it's critical that we understand that we're just starting to scratch the surface of how deeply corrupt all of this activity is. Just to wrap up, what happens in terms of the anatomy of how these crimes are committed is we start by patenting a pathogen. That creates the restraint of trade and the capacity for a single actor to have bioweaponization capabilities. Following that, a sole source and non-competitive academic grant program is put in place, much like what we see at UNC Chapel Hill, and ultimately its collaboration through Peter Daszak and others with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We have science, industry, and NGOs sitting on commercial boards like the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board at the World Health Organization, which stipulate that they have a financial interest in advancing a core technology. In this case, it's always vaccines. To get their vaccine accepted, they have to create an emergency war game. They have to coerce the public behavior, and that's not my assertion. That's their statement. We need the public to respond to hype. That was their words, not mine. And then what happens is we suppress known market options, like in the case of SARS-CoV. We know that in 2010, Ralph Barrett published what now the public knows as the Zelenko Protocol. We know that there was a countermeasure. We know it worked, and we know it was engineered by the guy who made the weapon in the first place. But rather than promoting that, which would make the emergency use authorization not apply to an experimental gene therapy, we suppress the known market options, in this particular case, known to be the Zelenko Protocol, known to be the published Barrett Protocol from 2010. We knew that there was a treatment for SARS infection if it was really infection. We knew that there was a treatment available. We knew it worked. We knew that hydroxychloroquine had been tested after the SARS 1.0. NIND had funded that research. We knew that there were market opportunities for treatment, and we willfully chose not to use them and actively suppress them. Every government actively suppressed them for the purpose of making sure that the known lethal agent was going to be selected as the only way out of the pathogen problem. Why do we know it was lethal? We know that the lipid nanoparticle that was going to be used to inject the mRNA already was scheduled as a toxic agent, and we know that the pseudouridine that was used as a stabilizing mechanism for the mRNA was known to be lethal, not just toxic. We knew it was lethal, and we went ahead and injected it into the arms of adults and children and infants and lactating mothers. And we knew all of that by 2018. None of this co-occurred with the alleged pandemic. which leads me to my conclusion, which is, do we need a Nuremberg trial? And my point is that the problem that we have, if we look at the Nuremberg trial, is that we failed to hold accountable what were considered to be the healthcare providers who were just following orders or doing their best or doing their job. Let me be abundantly clear. All the information that I have shared in this testimony was published, knowable, and known before the first patient was described in 2019 in December in Wuhan, China. None of the interventions are legally defined as emergency use medical countermeasures because all of them were put in motion prior to the existence of the declared pandemic. And because of that, the public has every reason in the world to actually hold the manufacturers and everyone else accountable, because all of this information was known in the public before December of 2019. And Sean, that's the punchline I want to make sure we don't lose. It is absolutely essential to describe the fact that there is no legal coverage, none, for the notion that anything that was done in response to the use of mRNA for SARS-CoV-2, none of it legally falls under the definition of medical countermeasure under an EUA, because all of this predates patient 1 in Wuhan.
Dr. Martin, you've made it clear. I mean, basically, you would class this as a biological weapon, and I think you'd agree with me that it was known to be intentionally toxic and or lethal. Am I right there?
Yes, that's absolutely
Okay.
correct. They said it in 2005.
Am I also correct, because you were talking about CRISPR technology and how they would benefit, that they knew in advance that this would change our DNA?
That's absolutely right. And we have to remember that the National Science Foundation project, which was called Darwinian Chemical Systems, started in 2000, going to 2010, which was the forerunner to the company Moderna. It's absolutely essential the public knows that the reason why it went into its corporate position is because they had succeeded in using mRNA to write into DNA. So every time someone said that this is safe and it's not going to affect your DNA, they knew they were lying. And the data that proved that they were lying was data that was available from 2008 to 2010 under the National Science Foundation grant.
Okay, because I want the public to understand that one of the things that these, vaccines that are based on the mRNA technology is it actually changes your physical genetic makeup. You will no longer have the same instructions you had. Now, I want to segue then into an intellectual property rights question. We're in the prairies, we're in the province of Alberta, and we have a lot of genetically modified crops.
Yes.
And it's now established laws. Let's say I've got a crop that isn't genetically modified, but somebody beside me is growing a Monsanto genetically modified crop,
yes,
that if their pollen comes onto mine and their intellectual property rights ends up in my crop, if I sell that for an advantage, then Moderna has a property interest at that point in my crop because I unwittingly have their genetic modification. Now, human beings that are genetically modified with, I'm assuming, intellectual property rights that are patented to companies like Moderna, does Moderna have a property interest in the humans that are now genetically modified with their proprietary technology?
So, Sean, one of the things that's important to point out, and just to be clear, you conflated in your last part of your question Moderna and Monsanto. Monsanto's crops, Moderna's people.
Right.
But your question is spot on. The legal condition that has now been established is that the wind blowing pollen constructively creates an infringement of a patent. That is correct. So the pollen from a genetically modified crop using Bacillus thuringiensis as the intermediary to do that genetically modified crop, when that crop shows up in a non-licensed grower's field, the wind has created an infringement which means that that particular grower is now guilty of a patent infringement because the wind blew. The theory that says that when you modify a living system with a genetically modified organism, the theory that has been established in the courts is that anything that includes the further replication or description of a patented genetic engineered product means that there's an intellectual property right that goes along with that particular right. Now, we know from the gene patent tests around the BRCA genes, the breast cancer signaling genes, which famously were the subject of the myriad genetics cases about a decade and a half ago. We know that when it comes to the human and the way in which humans can be either genetically modified or have substantial effort for genetic understanding of that particular human, the court has been very dubious in extending property rights to the human itself. However, we do not have a litigated answer to your question. We don't know whether or not you are actually, by virtue of the proprietary mRNA injection that is actually subject to patented material, and the fact that your body, having given the patented instructions to make a synthetic chimera of the spike protein, which is proliferating all over your body, and it is replicating all over your body, and as much as people lied and said, no, it just stays at the injection site, we now have all of the published literature that confirms what I said at the beginning, which is this stuff does not leave the body, it persists, and it spreads away from the injection site. By the way, the scientific evidence for that was already known well before there was a pandemic, well before the public was exposed to this experimental gene therapy, but the public was told that it would stay in the injection site and it wouldn't actually move. Well, that was a lie, and it was a lie that they knew was a lie when they said it. So this was not something that we had to figure out down the road. And what we now know is that we have a problem that the courts will ultimately have to figure out, because not only do we have the intellectual property now being reproduced inside of every injected person, so technically, to your analogy of the pollen and the crops, they are now at least reproducing patented technology within their own body. But now we have another problem, which is the CRISPR technology, where there is, in fact, the only potentially remediation of the process of the gene alteration is to then go through some process of clipping that information out. And then the question is, who owns the right to your body's information, which will then go into another proprietary system, this one being a CRISPR-like system, which would be used to edit the information out of your body, and then who owns the material that's harvested? And the answers to those questions have not been established, and we don't have evidence of any court that's actually even given us indication other than the references you made about crop distribution of proprietary rights in genetically modified organisms.
Right, and I'm going to turn you over to commissioners, but at least, it's out there that as people participate in this mRNA technology, that there are property right interests concerning their bodies that have not been resolved.
That's correct.
And I'll just turn you over to the commissioners for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. You said that Trump signed an executive order in 2019 so that Warp Speed was launched much before the pandemic. So I'm worried about this allegation because we see Trump as maybe a savior. So in your opinion, can we trust Trump, or was it like a strategy he had to do?
So that's a very good question, and what I will address is the facts. I can't go into motive with respect to Trump's awareness or lack thereof. I would suggest that it is probably practically impossible that he read the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board report on September 18th and one day later had an executive order to enable it. So something tells me that it all came through Alex Azar, who at the time was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and, we might add, was also under criminal investigation for antitrust violations for price-fixing diabetes medications in Mexico. So we have a criminal at HHS who in all likelihood had something to do with putting that executive order in front of the president on September 19th, 2019. Whether or not he knew what he was doing at that time, I can't opine. What I do know is that he signed the order on the 19th of September 2019. What I know is that Anthony Fauci definitely knew what was going on, because in his congressional testimony in the first week of December in 2019, once again, before there was a pandemic, Anthony Fauci clarified that it was in fact President Trump's executive order that authorized him to do the mRNA injection. So what I do know is that Anthony Fauci fully was aware that warp speed was in play, because he stated such in the first week of December 2019 before there was even the allegation of a patient in Wuhan, China. So is there a problem here? Absolutely. To date, the Trump administration then and the Trump administration now has been unwilling to even engage in a conversation about whether or not this was something that was something with which they had complicity, or whether there was a coup attempt inside of the HHS and NIAID to create a condition in which President Trump would ultimately lose an election the following year. Now, we know that the due process of fair and equitable process of gathering and assembling to have conversations about an upcoming election was without question impaired, because we had shutdown orders, we had the inability for people to gather, we had the outright restriction of free speech, which we know is a precondition to any democratic process. And given the fact that all of that was suppressed, one could argue that it was highly likely that agents operating within the administration fully intended to effectively overthrow his presidential aspirations. But do I know whether he knew or not? I don't, and I can't comment on his capability of having culpability, because I don't actually know anything other than the stated facts.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. You're saying that the patents themselves are like doing illegal things or patenting illegal things. My question is, what is the purpose to have a patent on something that is illegal?
Well, unfortunately, the patent system in the United States and under the Patent Bar Provision Treaty doesn't have a statutory bar from patenting illegal things. That's an unfortunate thing, because we actually, as a civilization, should demand that. But the reason why you file a patent, if you're the CDC or if you're anybody else, is to restrain the commercial use or the third-party use without your authorization of whatever is disclosed inside of that patent. So it's important to understand that when the CDC, for example, lied, as they did many times, and said that, well, they got this patent so that it would be free and fairly used by anybody, the fact of the matter is that's a patent lie, pun intended. You don't restrain what is in the public domain inside of a patent if you want the public to be able to access it. And so the CDC, by 2002, going into 2003, and NIH, by 2001, going into 2003, owned the entirety of the intellectual property regime around which SARS, this severe acute respiratory syndrome, was going to be developed. There was no chance that anybody could do anything without their market control being the dictating terms under which anything happened. This should be an illegal act, but just to make you feel slightly more uncomfortable, Right now, there are over 2,700 other patents on gain-of-function weapons covering 68 pathogens. 68, not one or two, 68. So there are over 2,700 patents now covering 68 biological weapons that are poised for exactly the same effect we had with COVID.
I guess the patents is the way, the legal way to show their willfulness, that they were that what they did was willful and intentional. Yeah. So they left trace of their crime.
Well, you need to understand that when Moderna altered its patent application in April 2019 to talk about the accidental or deliberate release of a respiratory pathogen, we have to focus on the operative term, release. They didn't say leak. They didn't say lab leak. They didn't say genetic emergence. They said release. That literally means that it's going to come out of a controlled environment. And that controlled environment is not nature. That controlled environment is something which is a human laboratory.
Thank you.
A couple quick ones, if that's even possible in this area. Dr. Martin, do you know what the stated reason was why University of North Carolina was exempted from the U.S. moratorium on gain-of-function research back in 2014?
Yes, the exemption was based on the fact that they were already funded. No kidding, that's what it says in the last paragraph. I can, by the way, submit for you guys the copy of the letter. I have the letter. Because it actually, you don't have to imply anything from it. They said because it's funded, they can keep going.
Okay. Another quick, if possible, question. As Canadians, of course, we have no right and no ability to scrutinize what has taken place in our own country with respect to the Winnipeg lab. We know of the expulsion of a couple of scientists who were sent back to Wuhan in 2019. Efforts for the last 5 years in Canada to have the government disclose the circumstances of that have not been successful. Are you able to share some insights? You've given an abundance of evidence on the interplay between various agencies and players in this evolving landscape. Are you able to tell us a little bit about what happened in Winnipeg?
Yes, that is a much longer question, and I apologize. I don't have the data for this presentation, and I told Sean I would stay with reference data for this presentation. I can certainly make reference to the individuals in question and what projects they were specifically working on, so that's something I'm happy to supply to the Commission at a later date. That'd be fine.
We would be very grateful if you'd be able to do that. One other quick question. I know we're on a tight timeline here. You've referred to the activities, you've called them co-conspirators, all signed off on what you regard to be antitrust and racketeering activities. The very institutions that are established to protect the public interest and to safeguard people are complicit in the activity that you've described. Do you, and you've raised the rhetorical question of whether it's time for a Nuremberg 2.0 type process, do you have any optimism that at some point the institutions capable of investigating and prosecuting people can actually be engaged to the point where we can start holding people accountable?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I apologize in advance for being potentially pragmatic in this. But what I can tell you is that we have had meetings with several attorneys generals here in the United States. We've obviously met with prosecutors in Europe. I have not had direct interaction with prosecutors in Canada, but what I will tell you is that we have an entire criminal indictment that we have prepared. To date, every single law enforcement agency who has reviewed it has agreed that we have established beyond reasonable doubt violations of antitrust, racketeering, reckless homicide, and in some cases in the use of remdesivir, premeditated murder. And to date, we have not had a single prosecutor who's been willing to take the case because of the fear of retribution.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Martin, thank you very much for giving me some more sleepless nights.
You're welcome. Least I can do.
A couple of things. First of all, millions and millions of people were coerced or frightened or persuaded to give consent to take the mRNA vaccines. I think you'd agree with me that that consent was certainly not informed consent. But I'd like, if you have any views on the fact that it's now quite clear from the literature that the phenomenon of shedding means that people who never took the mRNA virus are potentially infected by it anyway.
Yeah, let me unpack the both sides of that issue. First of all, no one consented to this injection. Informed consent is a legally defined term. The only waiver, certainly in the United States, the only waiver of informed consent is under 21 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 50.23, I believe it is, 20 to 23. And the only waiver that can be instituted is the Department of Defense, under the authorization of the President, can waive informed consent for military personnel. But there is no waiver of informed consent in Canada. You cannot waive informed consent. And there is no possibility that there was any consent given, because at no point did the public actually have disclosed to it that the lipid nanoparticle was a scheduled toxin and that the pseudouridine was a known toxic agent that included lethality in all of its animal trials. No one was disclosed at hospitals that remdesivir had been pulled in 2018 and 2017 from the Ebola clinical trials because it killed 53% of the people that received it. No one could have been given that informed consent because the information pre-2019, so all of this stuff predates 2019, all of the information showed that this was actually a, quote, straight to humans protocol. And that quote comes from the head of the Institutional Review Board at a University of California university, who actually told me when they asked for the safety data from animal studies, they were told not to make that request because, and I'm quoting from her, this was a straight to humans protocol. So it is impossible for anybody to have ever consented under the legal definition of consent to receiving this injection. That includes people in the clinical trials. The first 40,000 people that went into the clinical trials, none of them received legal informed consent. And it gets a little harder, and this is a technicality, but we must focus on it. Under U.S. and international law, the Institutional Review Board, which is required to review the ethics of a clinical trial, have to be independent and have no financial interest in the outcome of the research. Tiny problem is that all of the protocols were developed by the very individuals who had the financial interest in the research, which means that the protocol could not have even been reviewed under the legal ethics standard. So we don't just have an informed consent problem. We have a problem that precedes that. We don't have a legally impaneled institutional review board who ever reviewed any of these protocols. And as a result of that, it is legally impossible for there to have been consent. So that's for the people who got the injection. To your second component of your question, the issue of shedding is actually potentially slightly different in that what we know is that various forms of fragments of proteins or exosomes, depending on what school of thought and linguistics you like to use, have in fact been shown to move from the injected to the uninjected population. What we do not yet have in any reliable published studies is evidence of whether that information includes any of the mRNA encoding mechanisms which ultimately would write into the genetics of the uninjected. We do know that we expect genetic modification with the mRNA injection. What we do not know is what the shedding component does with respect to a permanent or even transient effect genetically for the uninjected. What we do know is that the symptoms of the protein expressions derived from the modified RNA have created a number of impacts, including an enormous number of issues for women, particularly around reproductive issues and menstruation issues. We know that there have been triggers of a variety of autoimmune type symptoms, but we don't know whether or not those things are having a genetic effect or whether they're merely having a population infectious effect.
Thank you. And one final question, with apologies for paraphrasing Marcus Aurelius, but he said that if you want to understand why something happens, you must ask what is its essence. Now, clearly the people who are responsible for this entire edifice were motivated by something, possibly by the fact that the science was cool, possibly by the fact that there was an enormous amount of money to be made, possibly by the fact that the potential for weaponization for future conflicts was useful, or perhaps something else. I'm just interested in your views on what motivated these people.
Well, the only thing we have is their published words. In 2011 and going through into 2012 and 13, Gavi, represented by Bill Gates and others, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board of the World Health Organization, which published the Decade of Vaccines report in 2011, made it abundantly clear that their purpose was to reduce the population on Earth. Gates referenced a reduction of population anywhere from 10 to 15%. Some of his public references took that number higher. If you go back to 1952 and World Health Organization's Director General, he explicitly said that the reason for using vaccination across populations was for population control. If you go back to 1910 to 1913, which is the slide that I made reference to in my presentation, you'll notice that the person who funded all of these activities at their inception was the same person who funded the U.S. Office on Eugenics. And that eugenics office continues right now at Cold Spring Harbor Lab here in the United States. So the fact of the matter is, as much as it's painful for the public to hear these words, the intent explicitly was to actually decrease the population. Not to control the population, to actually literally decrease the population. Now, if you think about Bill Gates' estimates of between 700 million and 1.2 billion people that need to be reduced off the face of the planet, I have said on numerous occasions, if you look at the downstream exposure risks to the toxins that were injected, it is reasonable to expect that they may have achieved their objective with what ultimately becomes relatively rapid-acting cancers. We now have the proliferation of what we call turbo cancers, which was a term that we now have normalized, but it certainly wasn't normal 5 years ago. We now know that it's very fashionable for now young people to have myocarditis and other cardiovascular disease, something that we did not have 5 years ago. We are now being told that that's because of environmental changes. Obviously, there's not a single environmental condition that is altered other than the injection of a known toxin, which actually was targeting as early as 1992, targeting heart tissue. So we're sitting there pretending not to know why, even though we do know why. But the fact of the matter is, they actually stated in 2014 that this was about investors responding if they see profit at the end of the process. And we need to be very clear on the fact that Wellcome Trust, who is one of the three architects of this nonsense, along with the Gates Foundation, along with Dustin Moskowitz's Open Philanthropy and others, we know that they combined interest statements have said that they want less people on Earth and they want to make money on the way there. Those are the two things that they've said. What I think is really not relevant in sworn testimony, but their words are evidence in sworn testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I just have one simple question. A lot of people feel that they are safe because they took J&J and AstraZeneca, and they don't feel that this is going to affect them at all. And they feel sorry for the Pfizer and the Moderna people. What's your take on that?
Well, I will I will be very precise in my response. That's a fair question. And what I would say is that introducing a scheduled biotoxin into your body, regardless of who manufactures it, is a bad idea. There is no question that the greater concern is the mRNA. And the reason why it's a greater concern is because in the case of J&J and AstraZeneca and some of the other injections that were developed in like Sinovac and some of the Russian stuff and some of the Indian stuff, where they took a more classic version of what we think of as immunization technology, the likelihood is that the people who were going to suffer the most immediate adverse events did so. In fact, if we think about J&J and the significant clotting issues, most of the things that were going to create significant and mortal problems actually happened when it happened. So we had the clots, we had the deaths, we had the sudden deaths, we had all those kinds of things. But what we don't know, and there is no way of knowing this because there has been no public disclosure on the exact nature of what was injected in any of the manufacturer's injections. What we don't know is the long-term exposure risks to any of the adjuvants that were in the injection. We don't know what the actual sequences were. And given the fact that this was not a naturally derived substance at all, this was a chimera. It came out of a scheduled biological weapons program. We do not have any reason to have optimism or pessimism, because we just don't know, that somehow or another AstraZeneca or J&J is an advantage, except for the fact that we know the ingredients that went into the mRNA injection were pro-oncologic, meaning that they were going to accelerate the development and proliferation of cancers. We knew that. And we knew that they were going to target the myocardial tissue, so we knew that we were going to have heart problems after the injection. So we do know that the mRNA has an established, published basis for being more problematic. But given the fact that we haven't had any disclosure at a sufficient level of the actual ingredients of any of the injections, it's impossible to have a definitive answer on AstraZeneca or on J&J.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin, thank you for attending. If you can provide me with the letter granting Chapel Hill the exemption, and then those materials on the Winnipeg lab, we'll make those exhibits, and Commissioners, the slide deck is Exhibit 52 in these proceedings. Dr. Martin, on behalf of the National Citizens Inquiry, I'd like to sincerely thank you for participating and sharing with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for hosting this, and I'm available if you need any follow-up.
Thank you.